Welcome back to YHS Virtual 2020, guys. We hope you enjoyed your second coffee break. Again, apologies for the limited interaction with you during these times. However, we do what we can. Our next panel is again titled Men plus Women equals Diversity. For this panel, we would firstly like to welcome the founder and managing partner of Living Potential International, Ms. Elaine. Ms. Teo prides herself in delivering client-tailored leadership development and intercultural interventions for some of the world's most prestigious organizations.
Alongside Mrs. Teo, we would like to welcome Mr. Paul Genovese, the president of Grizzly Energy Resources. Mr. Genovese is a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion and comes from the oil and gas industry. He will lend us the perspective of a heavily male-dominated industry. So please give a warm welcome to both of our panelists.
Again, a quick reminder, you can put any questions into the Q&A box on your webinar and just go and ask ahead. Welcome.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Hi, everyone.
Perfect. Hello.
The floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you so much for having us. It's such a fantastic opportunity to be participating in this inaugural leadership summit for young hoteliers. We're very pleased, Paul and myself, to have a chance to share with you a little bit today about some of the issues facing companies, leaders, but also workers. So we look forward to this being a participative session with all of you being role players and being able to bring about this positive change that we want to create in terms of diversity and inclusion. Paul, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, no, it's I'm tickled to be here today. Obviously, I am not directly involved in the hospitality industry, but I did grow up in a retail furniture business, so I'm familiar with a very customer-facing organization, let's say. But I think it's important that I'm here because you know, so much resistance that has been diversity and inclusion initiatives have faced. Reasons why corporations have not adapted better is because of people that look a lot like me. You know, the Fortune 500 CEO looks like me. He's age 60, and 75% of these men are white. So for a long time, we felt excluded from the discussion. And between Elaine and I, we strongly believe that to have some adherence to these programs, which are good for business and good for individuals as well, it's necessary to involve all stakeholders in the conversation. So I'm really happy to be part of the conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. The way we'd like to structure our session today is as follows. Paul and myself will spend the first 30 minutes of today's session sketching out some systemic factors that we have to consider when we're looking at diversity and inclusion. It is a known fact that D&I, for short, is a very big topic for everyone nowadays, not just for the hospitality industry, but also for many other industries as well. For example, energy, oil and gas, also finance. We do a lot of work with our financial clients as well. We see the similar patterns. I was just reading an article today on advertising, also having a similar sort of problem in terms of D&I. So this is one of the perspectives that we want to bring into the room today. We want to just share some of these systemic factors which are holding back people from creating more inclusive and more supportive cultures. We want to look at what are some of the reasons why these D&I initiatives have such a high failure rate. So we want to also then set the context and look at that not just in terms of these systemic factors that are across society, because some of the issues that we'll be looking at are actually psychological factors which affect everybody regardless of which industry you're on. We also want to add some urgency. Why is this even a business problem in the first place? You know, why should we actually care about increasing D&I? So we'll like to share a little bit later on about some statistics and some studies as to what are the plus factors and what are the minus factors for the case for D&I in the workplace. We'll also obviously like to spend some time specifically about hospitality, and here's where we welcome your questions as well to find out what is your specific concerns. We've got some questions that was submitted through to us earlier on, where we look at hospitality being, for example, a very operational industry and how that has a particularly detrimental effect on things like family life, work-life balance, and how that could drag on women specifically who are looking to rise within the industry. And finally, we want to paint the opportunity. I'm personally, as a solutions finder, very fed up when there are a lot of attentions on problems. As we say, if you want to become an expert on the problem, you focus on the problem. If you want to become an expert on the solution, you focus on the solution. So we would like to end today's session before we break into the Q&A with some next steps. What are some things that we can all do? Because everybody has a role to play. What are some ways in which we can each play our part, no matter which level of the industry we're at, whether we're entry level or sitting at the top of an organization? Everybody has a part to play. So what are some of these tips that we can share in terms of helping to close this gap for DNI? So without any further ado, let me start first by asking you, Paul. So let's set the context a little while. What are some of the challenges that companies and the leaders face in terms of creating and influencing this kind of culture that is truly empowering from a diverse and inclusive? What do we actually see in the market up there at the moment?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of talk of progress, but that's relative, right? I mean, but one really startling statistic when we look at the gender makeup, let's say, of Fortune 500 companies, is in 2018 there were more Fortune 500 CEOs named James than all of the women Fortune 500 CEOs combined. That should be really startling. And the next statistic is that there are 2 more female CEOs of these companies than men with the name John, although all those men named John are white. So that just gives you an idea of what that landscape looks like. So the challenges, as we'll have some opportunity to discuss today, are certainly many, but a large part of it is just this maintenance of the status quo, whether intentionally or unintentionally. A lot of it is familiarity bias. If you don't have females in the pipeline, and you don't have them in early, this is what boils to the top. And like tends to hire like. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as well.
That's a great point, because one of the things that we did when we were doing the background research, for our panel, was actually discovering that this top-heavy pyramid of senior male white leaders was prevalent across different industries, wasn't it? And you've highlighted the point about sort of familiarity bias. Tell us a little bit about your experiences within the oil and gas industry. Perhaps there might be some relevant examples there. What were some of the actual incidents that you faced?
Yeah, well, as you might gather, the oil and gas industry is very male-dominated. In fact, worldwide, when we look at the entirety of the oil and gas industry, there's probably only about 15 to 20% female membership in there. And of course, as you rise through the technical ranks and the professional ranks, those female numbers get smaller and smaller. So I saw very few, a handful in my entire career of female managers at all levels, especially at the executive level. What I saw is women who did a remarkable job navigating what essentially is a minefield of various levels of male toxicity. And to succeed, I observed that they had to learn to play the men's game. And so now there are a number of organizations within my industry that hold up some female leaders and, appropriately herald them for the achievements they've had. But, my thought always was, you shouldn't have to be a superhero, just to go to work and do your job. So, yeah.
Yes. And I'll add to that. So when I was speaking at the Barings Women's Network panel on designing success behaviors for both men and women in the workplace here in London last week, this is a topic that we explored in detail, and I made the case for the fact that women's and minorities' advancement should never really be only about the women taking action or the minorities taking action. And one of the things that we'll discuss later on before we open this up to the floor is also just to broaden the definition of diversity, because there are many different kinds of diversity, and gender diversity and ethnic diversity are only 2 of the many faces of diversity. So one of the things that we talked about was really about what's keeping the current status quo as what it is. And in order to do that, I think we talked about things like the familiarity bias, but I think also there's a whole area, and here's where we get into a hospitality-specific challenge, which is around how do we look at the wider social pressures that play, across men and women. Let's just take that as one specific example. So if you were to look at many studies, for example, there was a recent Harvard Business Review study, which is excellent, which was published quite recently, And it talked about what are the real factors holding ambitious women back across industries. And one of them was about workload. And I think what's very interesting is when we look at the social expectations of what men expect and what women expect in terms of a workload, there are really entrenched expectations that are broadly true across different cultures across the world, maybe more evident in certain cultures, say for example in India, where there are very clear-cut gender expectations, and maybe less so for cultures like yourselves in America, for example, or for myself in Singapore, where there is more gender equity, at more sort of senior levels. But I think if we were to take a step back and set the context for why, diversity and inclusion initiatives that only stick to lists of do's and don'ts are doomed to fail long term because they only touch the surface. And if you were to go in, for example, like the Harvard Business Review article recommended as its main thrust, that companies look at workload and that we should find some way to actually reduce the workload for both men and also women. That's very easy to say. But what does that actually look like in terms of implementation? What one really needs to do is to take a step below and actually look at the kinds of social pressures. And many of these pressures are evident and many of these pressures are silent. Growing up as a Singaporean Chinese woman, I can tell you straight away that in my culture, for example, you end up having a lot of expectations where my work can almost never really be number one. It has to be maybe joined number one with my role as being a mother, for example, or my role, as being a family person. But there's still large undercurrents, in many societies all over the world that result in this disparity of expectations of women needing to kind of be it all, be great at work, and at the same time, cook kids' meals, and at the same time watch the rugby match with the men. And I think both of us. Similarly, so for men, there's a whole separate set of social expectations, and I'd love for you to share some of those from your perspective as senior white male American. What are some of these similar kinds of social expectations that hold you back as a man from being more inclusive in the workplace?
Yeah, well, gosh, there's a whole bunch of them, but I think of these things as sort of self-reinforcing mythologies. That there are these social expectations for men and women, and they affect how we make decisions. So you mentioned the Harvard Business Review article about, part of the problem is that we're working too hard, and men would like to have opportunities for family leave and so forth, just as much as women do. But because of the societal pressures, it's easier for a man to say, I'm going to take one for my family, I'm going to work hard and succeed for my family. Now, and on the flip side, a woman will say, well, people are expecting me to be a mother, so I'm going to put my career aspirations aside. I'm going to take one for the family. However, let's consider a woman who says, no, my career is important to me. I want to ascend to senior leadership. She's viewed by other women and men in that company as like, oh, she doesn't care about her family. She doesn't put her family first. What kind of person is that? So a lot of women end up leaving their career aspirations aside to pursue family interests because that's what's expected of them. A lot of men don't do that because that's what's expected of them. So that's one, these reinforcing mythologies. And I think studies have borne out that these are mythologies when you drill down and look at the actual reasons why men stay and women leave. The other thing is men are afraid. I mean, in a way, it seems silly because we hold the levers of power, right? But when it comes to, acting responsibly and speaking out on behalf of women and other, underrepresented people in the workplace, we are viewed, and studies have shown this, we are viewed as more effeminate. We face criticism from our fellow males, let's say if we speak up for a female colleague. And we are viewed by both men and women as somehow being more feminine and not focused on the prize, not focused on the goal. So there's a whole cultural shift that needs to take place. And part of the pathology of this is that we've not been included in discussion when it comes to diversity and inclusion. We can say that we support it, but it's always posed as, well, we're part of the problem, or even worse, well, that's your problem, you deal with that. But until we get to a point where we're starting to have conversations like we are now, where we have all stakeholders equally involved in a common solution, I don't think we move forward.
Agree. And that's, I think, where we're going to be getting to, Paul, as we get closer to the tail end of our presentation, where we start to suggest what truly inclusive behaviors will look like on behalf of everybody. What would a conversation look like when the men are actually in the women's network discussions and the men are actually in, other networks, or, the white, the Caucasians perhaps, are in the ethnic minority networks, because those, you're absolutely right. With many of these networks, they tend to be populated by people from within their background, and that doesn't draw the circle wide enough to actually truly be able to visualize what a post-barrier, post-boundary reality can look like when everybody gets to play with their strengths. Everybody gets to be a whole person, rather than, oh, here's Elaine, who is Singaporean Chinese, early 40s, and then everyone gets parsed. But that's, I think, the point that we want to be getting to. I wanted to expound on your point a little bit, because I think I want to bring in some facts about the hospitality industry here that I've observed, and I'd love if any questions come through from the audience that might be specific to these. But prior to the session, the organizers of the summit did gather some questions from the students, and they were questions like, do you know of any strategies in place to directly recruit and target young female apprentices, and do you think those programs are beneficial? So that point was really about direct policies and practices within companies to encourage, the recruitment of young female apprentices and graduates. I think one of those things we have to think about when we answer these questions one by one is that you still end up with the same problem of women leaving halfway, middle management. So that's just to point out that that's one of the challenges with that particular question. Although, of course, many of the companies that you see now, you will see a lot of recruiters, for example, across industries being specifically asked to hire female candidates. So there is definitely a change in the tide that we can do a lot more. Other questions that came through were about different types of diversity. The question goes, when we refer to diversity, we mostly think about men versus women, and most we think about LGBTQ and the disabled. These are all demographic factors. When will we start thinking about more high-level factors that make humans unique, such as cognitive diversity and diversity of experiences? Do we think it's important that we should give merit to psychographics than demographics? The short answer to that, which we'll talk about shortly, is absolutely yes. Paul, you're an expert in real passionate about cognitive diversity and how that makes a difference to business performance. So I'd love you to talk about that later on. Questions also around technology. How could it have an impact on diversity in the workplace? What shape would that take? Fourth question was, is gender equality rooted in culture or in education and opportunities? This is a huge piece, which we've already spent some time talking about, which we will talk a little bit about when we talk about unconscious bias and how that gets encoded in cultural behaviors that we take on as kids. And many of these sit of personalities, so you can't even get at them with a piece of diversity and inclusion training that only sits on the intellectual point of view and doesn't get down into these deeper factors. And we've got a little video to share with you there to illustrate that point as well. The fifth point is what we talked about earlier on. The distribution of gender in the hospitality industry seems to be quite even. However, if we look closer, it looks like very few women hold any executive positions. What can the leaders of the industry do to ensure there's an equal distribution of power? So that's the point that we made earlier on about the triangle. Now, let's look specifically within the hospitality industry. We've got that same problem of fewer women and minority use at the top of the industry. I think when I was having a chat with some senior members of the hospitality industry in the last couple of weeks, one of the things that they pointed out was the hierarchical nature of the hospitality and the travel industries in particular, whereby it tends to be the case that, the old style, the old image, be it of the hotel GM, you would not be surprised if you walked into a hotel and someone who looks like you, Paul, comes up in a nice suit, shakes your hand, and you read the shiny name tag and it says, Paul Genovese, hotel GM, blah, 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 hotel. It's still very much the standard expectations that not only the staff have, but the guests have as well. Now that's changing. Of course, the hospitality industry is in a state of transition like in many of the other industries, but it's still a bit of an uphill battle, I think, specifically within the hospitality industry, because the sense of hierarchy And I think many of you listening in who are from the hospitality industry, will recognize this. The hierarchy, this sense of command and control of there being all these different very clear tiers of staff, operational staff within the hospitality industry is still perhaps more prevalent as a business model and as an operational model than in many other industries. So I think that's when we were thinking about the background to this session, that was one of the factors that we really identified. And I'd love to know in the Q&As if there are any specific questions around this particular point. If anyone wants to challenge us, please feel free to do so. I think also there's the whole sense of the fact that it is also a very demanding career for work-life balance. When I was taking part in the gender equity panel, which was 2 years ago, which was also organized by the Hoteliers, it was the first ever student organized gender equity panel, and there was a very big topic there around how do we, as ambitious young female students, here at Lausanne, how do we crack this work-life balance equation? And it's particularly tough because I have many friends who are in hospitality, whether it's operations or whether it's events. And it's very clear that it is you're really on the job and you are at the beck and call of your VIP clients. We're seen also with the current situation. I lived through the travel industry during SARS, for example, because I was working with Singapore Airlines in sales and marketing. So I saw firsthand your load factors drop precipitously and you have to respond to that. So I think when it comes to the kinds of pressure or that we see in terms of society, I think this seems to be a particularly acute problem. How does a talented, ambitious woman balance that challenge? I think the third thing also in terms of hospitality would be around the culture of the smiling face. When you think about service orientation, there's always this sense, if you think about your Four Seasons, you think about your Cathay Pacific, you think about, your Aman Resorts, and the image that you have is one of fantastic service, and fantastic service comes with a smile. It also comes with a certain blankness almost, like you are here to do the best by the client, and that almost means that you have to keep private however you're feeling. You just have to rock up to service with your best face on, and that is almost a culture of suppression that we see in other forward-facing industries as well. But I think when you look at the fact that this is an absolutely critical success factor for hospitality, I think that's a real challenge when it comes to the kinds of positive behavior we want to be encouraging when we talk about a truly inclusive workplace. Because in order to succeed in the hospitality industry, there's almost a certain amount of not bringing your emotions to work. So I think the question that we'd like to talk about is, to throw it back to the audience perhaps, as a follow-up discussion, what would a psychologically healthy workplace that balances these two aspects of being a human being? On the one hand, putting the service face up and being able to do that day in, day out to a certain level of consistency. And second of all, how do you self-care? How do you self-care as a person if you're having an absolutely crap day? If your grandmother is lying ill in a hospital and you still have to show up anyway, how can the industry help to support people, so that they can better then send that service out? And I think this is a real challenge when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because that aspect of what excellence is considered, dictates that. I think the final point, and this is a challenging one, is in the face of Me Too. So I had a couple of confidential conversations with a couple of young female professionals within the industry, and all three of them were questions of there was some harassment, on the job, and they felt very alienated and they felt very alone. So unfortunately, there was a real case of that silence really kicking in a negative way. Here is an industry that prizes people who present really well. And of course, this applies to men as well as to women. But if you've had a chance to go to the campus, for example, or the École Hotelière, I mean, they're the best dressed. I think everyone here who knows the campus well would know that it's a campus where everyone's expected to present themselves very well. And unfortunately, when it comes to the kinds of behaviors that we want to encourage. The big question in the room is, how do men and women navigate this minefield, of there being a certain amount of attractiveness that's almost expected in the industry? How does one talk openly about it? How does one challenge that? How does one create a healthy company culture where you can kind of balance a certain amount of that attractiveness, but at the same time allow people to be whole? These are all pretty challenging questions.
It's super important, and I was so shocked to learn about some recent research about Me Too, and that's actually exacerbated the problem for women advancing in companies, because in just a few years' time span, the number of one-on-one senior male to junior female mentorships and sponsorships has declined by about 32% in Fortune 500 companies, and it's because now men are afraid. They don't know what to do. They're afraid they're going to be accused of sexual harassment somehow if they're left alone with a female. And it's just a toxic dialogue, and we need to bridge that gap if there's going to be progress.
Let's have a look at the solutions now. We've talked about some of the problems, so we can hold those in mind. And then I think I'll let you to share a little bit about the upside. Let's look at things like cognitive diversity. Let's look at things like the business case, before we actually look at some of the behaviors that stand in the way of that. What do you have to share with us about why is it important for companies and leaders nowadays to create such an inclusive culture in the first place? What are some benefits that the companies and the employees can stand to gain from having a more diverse and inclusive culture?
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, there's a case for retention, for having a workplace where people are engaged, and a number of studies have shown when employees are engaged, their productivity increases like 60-something%. So there's that aspect of it. But if you just want to take the view of financial performance, there are a number of studies in the last 3 or 4 years that show unequivocally companies that have more diverse boards, more diverse senior leadership, and whose employees feel like their leadership walks the walk when it comes to diversity are significantly 25% or more profitable. So to me, those are established facts. I'm not sure how broadly those are accepted at this point, but that should be impetus enough.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the factors underlying that superior performance? Let's take cognitive diversity, for example.
Yeah.
I remember you were telling, this fabulous story about cognitive diversity that you experienced in your workplace. Do you care to share that story?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just as a bit of a backstory, when I left graduate school and went to work, I worked at Texaco Exploration and Production as a geologist, and I was selected to be on a global mentorship program. So we had about 75 students in that inaugural class, and I think we represented like 17 countries around the world, because Texaco, of course, is a global brand. And of course, there were people who didn't speak my language, didn't look like me at all. And so from a physical or demographic diversity standpoint, we all looked really different. I mean, it was obvious like who North American males were and who, let's say, Asian females were, and so forth. But we were given unbeknownst to us, we were given a number of psychometric tests, and one was the Curtin Adaptation Innovation Inventory, and this was one that measured your creative style. Are you, freewheeling and free thinking, or do you feel more comfortable close to the fence? And as another project, we were given a blank piece of poster paper, and we had about a month to create a poster, and all we were told was make a poster about your heroes. No guidelines, whether you use pictures or words, whatever. And then when we assembled as a global group again, the 75 of us in Houston, we were asked to put our posters to the corresponding number on the wall. And you could see how the style of the posters changed as we went around the room. One side was all bullet points, people itemizing who their heroes were. Somewhere in the middle, there were a lot of pictures. And on the other end, there was basically a narrative describing. And so we looked around the room and we were like, oh my gosh, there's a pattern here. And that pattern was revealed by that psychometric test. And so the person out of the group of 75 who was most like me was a female Nigerian production engineer. And we were the only two in the room that expressed, who our heroes were through pictures only. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and we just busted out laughing because it just basically dispelled any notion that because we look different and we come from distinctly different backgrounds that we think differently. In fact, we thought very much alike.
Well, that's such an interesting story. What do you think are some of the dangers, therefore, in companies perhaps making the assumption that just because this is a young, a female Nigerian engineer and this is, a senior male white American, that therefore they must...
No, I was a junior at that point, but yes, I was waiting.
Yeah. How do you think that might be a danger? Do you think it's important to have physical diversity anyway?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. And there's a lot of research that has borne that out. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about sort of the tailor-made ideal team to solve a particular type of problem. But if you do nothing else, put people together that look differently, that have different ethnic and educational backgrounds, people of different ages and so forth. Because what the research shows is that when we see someone who is different than us, we think about how we think about our own problems. And it's a little bit strange. So we think that that person looks different than me, they're going to challenge my ideas. They're going to have a different opinion. So I think more critically of my own ideas, and ultimately that brings a better solution to the table. So if you do nothing else, yes, please do assemble groups of people that look differently together.
So that's one tip that we could take away to actually make a concrete attempt to put people there. And I definitely think that's the case when you start having board type situations where you have groups whereby you just simply having more of that physical diversity around just breaks everybody out of that group thing that you talked earlier about. Talk about how cognitive diversity and neurodiversity can actually help companies to come up with better solutions to problems. How does that work?
Right. Well, when we talk about cognitive diversity, we're really talking about diversity of thought. And when it comes to things that companies are interested in, I mean, what's the big buzzword we hear everywhere? It starts with an I. It's innovation, And I remember being told, okay, we got to get on this innovation background. General Electric was at the forefront of this. Jack Welch, you may have heard of, was a real pioneer and pushed this. And so we were told by our management, go out there and innovate. It's not that easy because, we all think differently. So if you want to come up with the best solutions to a problem, you want to assemble a group of people who are comfortable with generating lots of different ideas and bring that marketplace of ideas to the table. Conversely, and this could be in terms of like a product lifestyle, once we have some good ideas and we want to, select one or two and we want to package them and market them neatly, well, maybe you want people who are a little bit more constrained in their thought process and are detail oriented and so forth. Yeah, so by defining the problem at hand, you can get a better idea of what sort of individuals or what sort of mix of individuals you need to assemble to best solve that problem.
Yeah. Let's go now into solutions. As one of the status quo, perhaps, I'm sorry to box you in a corner over there, but someone who is, passionately interested in moving the needle with regard to making companies more diverse and inclusive, what do you think are some things that the senior male white leaders in industries, hospitality included, can start to explore? What are some best practices, you think?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure you start at the top. I mean, we could talk about this. We talk about leadership within, but for enlightened males, in senior roles, they do have a unique opportunity to have an impact. And we talked about this when we were at a panel at Barings Bank talking to the CFO there. He was very receptive to the D&I initiatives that Barings is bravely taking on now, and just happens to have 3 daughters. So that is the single greatest metric when it that determines whether or not men really fully embrace these ideas. So we need men like that in those positions to really walk the walk. And it's not enough to say, yes, I support maternal leave or family leave. You have to take it. Right? You have to lead by example. Another real big issue that is cited by females who decide to leave their career aspirations aside is that they don't feel like they're mentored. They don't feel like they have a sponsor. They feel essentially unsupported, and this becomes increasingly so as they rise to the ranks of the company.
Yes.
So they don't have that network and sponsorship. So it's critical if you're a senior male to deliberately reach out to female aspirants, at all levels.
Definitely.
But men in general, we don't have to talk about leadership, at least as defined on a corporate board. We all can be leaders. So, for example, I worked with some amazing women in my industry, but in group dynamics and meetings, they tend to be just a little bit more quiet, a little less forceful in getting their opinion across. And frequently, and I hope I don't demonstrate this today, Elaine, but frequently I see men stomping on speech. That's my term. We stomp on women's speech. So if you're a man and you see this happening in the meeting, then you speak up and you call it out and you say, "Excuse me, Elaine hasn't finished her point yet. Would you please let her continue?" Things like that.
Okay. Perfect. That gives me the perfect opportunity to segue into a little video that I wanted all of the people to share here, which we can then use as a break into the questions and answers. Thank you to everyone for sending through the Q&As. It's fantastic to see this engagement going on. This video is going to be talking about unconscious bias, and it's a chance for us to really stare the problem in the face, meaning to say, if we come up with programs that are only dealing with what you do and what you don't do, and you don't address emotions, you don't address motivation, you don't address unconscious body language and unconscious behaviors, why this problem is actually so difficult to crack. So let's have a look at the video. It's called Everyone Does It.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door, everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
That video is the video that we use to talk about unconscious bias, because I think everyone can relate to a situation where you just feel this pressure to just conform. But the problem is we don't like to admit it to ourselves that we're just like the guy who was looking at his watch. And so when we come to a lot of D&I initiatives, they only stay at that surface level, and you don't really address what's going on in the room, which is that you feel this peer pressure or this societal pressure or this cultural pressure, which is back to your point, Paul, before we open this up to the floor for questions. it must come from everybody. Of course, senior leadership has a critical role to play, but don't think that just because you are not at a senior level that you can't also start to influence, behaviors for the good. So I'd love to open up the floor to questions now. Could we please have some questions on the table? Would the presenters like to take some of these questions, or shall we look through the questions that have been placed
Thank you
through?
both for your insight. And yes, we can continue with the Q&A. As we all know, this topic is very sensible and we have multiple. I would like to start with the first one, and it's for Mr. Genovese. As you alluded to, that you look like the typical CEO, how are you and others who look like you working to bring women and other minorities into the conversation and have a seat at the table?
Yeah. It's it's difficult at first. Let's think about the elevator. The discomfort of being different. And, men who speak out, and we have some good examples of this, some friends who were in the finance industry who basically decided they wanted to take paternity leave. It's great about the company. But they were criticized by their male colleagues basically for being wimps, for taking advantage of that. So you have to walk the talk. But you do it through personal actions. And let's go back to the elevator episode. When you feel discomfort, you can act like the crowd, or you can dwell in that discomfort and make a decision that will make a difference. So just thinking, when I get on the elevator, I'm very uncomfortable that people are not talking. So I always click my toes together and say something like, I'm wearing new socks today. It's uncomfortable, but you find that people, laugh and will play along. And what I find when I speak out on behalf of women and minorities in companies, I may be the first one, but there's a whole bunch of people that will speak out after that. And it's very important when trying to lead from within to develop a network of allies. For me, both men that do the same, but also for women who will support us as well. It's critically important.
One of the things I'll add to that is the importance of sponsorship and advice. So when we look at the difference in mentoring and sponsoring for women and my workplace, for example, one of the most powerful things that keep the men in the status quo is the fact that men are very good at advocating for each other and for sponsoring each other, because it's kind of part of how that group behavior happens. And one of the things that people like yourself, Paul, can really do to make a difference to answer the question is to actively lean in and to support and to advocate for women and minorities. And that could include things like calling out negative behavior. And they're small, behind that person's back. So say, for example, I walk into a meeting and somebody, makes a little comment to you about something that is derogatory to me. It is, I think, every single male white's opportunity to actually say, hey, you know what? Not sure I'm okay with that, and I think that is really the little incremental things that everybody can do. And if you do it once, you do it twice, I think the key thing is to change your habit. You do need consistent application, and you need a certain frequency of application as well. And if it doesn't just come from the top, but if it gets caught, for example, at the pub, or at lunch, or these little social events, and it all adds up. So that's something I would encourage all of you listening in as well, to stand in and to stand up and to kind of hold that space for everybody.
So you believe is about the first person taking the initiative and showing actually how they should behave, because as you showed in the elevator, it was just necessary one person and everyone was just following, not even knowing why they were doing it.
Yes, and I had a real life example of this on the London Tube 2 days ago. You're not allowed to bring alcohol into the underground, which is the subway system in London. And I stood on the subway and 5 very well-dressed young white attractive 20-something men came in openly holding beer cans, and they knew they were doing something wrong. They openly stood in a circle, and nobody in the tube felt comfortable challenging that behavior. So what was interesting was one of the group peeled away and sat down. He looked miserable. He was sitting opposite him. I've got a picture of him actually. He was sitting there alone, clearly not comfortable with the group, but feeling that elevator behavior, that this was the group expectation and he had to be with the in-group. And he looked so unhappy. If I had more guts, or if I had been a guy, or when Paul and I, we talked about this, and Paul was like saying, well, if we were together, would we have behaved that? numbers. When you are not feeling alone, when you have conversations like this, like I'm having a conversation, I was saying, this is not okay. I could have, and I have done so before, actually gone to the guy and had a word with him, or find some way in which you can start to intervene in these things, because he did not look like he was enjoying himself. He looked like he was forced to go along in this behavior, and he was just literally just drinking the can to empty because that's what was expected of him. So the elevator speech, the elevator scenario is a funny scenario, but when I teach my children and I show them the same video, I say this is how the Holocaust happened. This is how genocides happen. When you have, the only thing necessary for evil to flourish is for good men to stand by and do nothing. So it's really about taking that initiative, and that initiative could be expressing your frustration in the bar with your friend afterwards saying, I felt so impotent and that sucks. I wish I could do something about it, because the more we surface these conversations, the more we build up our courage and our resolve. If you're in the workplace, it takes just those two. Paul, tell the story about the air, when you were doing the check-in thing and you stood up for the chap who was bullying the lady.
Yeah. I mean, and just this underscores the point that I think, a lot of us have good instincts. We have a sense of justice and fairness, but for various reasons we don't act. So I was checking into an airplane at the gate, and there was a delay, and there was one man, an older white man, incidentally, and they wanted to take his bag away and gate check it, and he desperately didn't want to do that. And he was getting in a heated confrontation with the gate agent there, who was a young woman. And people were sort of watching this happen. And so finally, I just decided I would intervene. And I got up and I went and I stood between him and the gate agent, and about 4 or 5 other guys just followed me. So I think in an organization, there are a number of people, and you can try and identify other champions, other allies. And like Elaine says, she made the excellent point that it's difficult to do it alone, but if you find other people, or you lead by example, you'll find that there's a lot more people who agree with you than you might otherwise think. But it takes that first step.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the answer. Last question. How would you suggest a workplace may tackle, say, toxic masculinity? What kind of strategies do you think are really feasible where women will be able to come through more than just halfway, as Elaine mentioned before?
Excellent question. Big and important question, and a difficult question. I think the first thing that we have to look at is where are some of the factors of toxic masculinity, and we've shared a few in that beer scenario. I think it's got to come down to the workplace fostering a more emotionally open culture. And that can happen at multiple points. So I would encourage everybody listening here to model that behavior first by having the guts to show up to your work as your whole self every day as much as possible. And that, to Paul's point, is easier when you've got allies. So use those lunch breaks, going to the pub for drinks, use those as chances for you to engage in a more authentic way with your work colleagues. And if you open that interaction as diversely as possible, what you're actually doing is building an informal network that is emotionally connected based on the whole person that you are. So some tips could be, for example, asking about people's family, or you talking about something, but you want that conversation to end up being personal, because one of the large factors behind toxic masculinity is the fact that we have whole generations of men who have grown up being taught to suppress their emotions. And this is true worldwide. And they've been taught that in things like team sports and things like warfare, if you stop and look at the way in which a young boy and a young girl grow up, and I've got 2 sons, one's age 13, one's age 11, I've got a daughter age 9, and I see every day the different cultures that they grow up in the boys' school and the girls' school. In the boys' school, what happens is team sports. I've been in football fields where I've seen my son's friend limping off with the blood streaming down from his nose, and there's a woman going, oh my God, poor thing, this, that. And what are the fathers doing? The fathers are going, yeah, good on you, you're being so brave. the huge messages being passed on to young men and young women starting already from age 5. And don't forget, every young boy plays football or something, but not every young girl plays netball or lacrosse. Team sports is one of the breeding grounds, for these kinds of emotion-suppressing behaviors, where the kind of messaging that comes through is, you've got to take it for the team, you can't show any weakness, you've got to keep a chin up, don't show pain, they will take advantage of you. So it's no wonder that so many men bring that into the workplace. So I think the first thing is to start first by understanding that these are some of the factors that we're playing against, and some of these behaviors, like the lift behavior, have gone on for a very long time. So we mustn't expect that we're going to be able to change things overnight, but we must redouble our determination to, just like a drop of water, every day, just whittle away at that. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a real good point about sports, and Elaine and I talked about this at some length, but yeah, I mean, men are brought up in this hyper-competitive environment, where we're, basically physically violent towards one another in the sense of sport, but that translates to the workplace as well. And I, realized from talking to Elaine and other female colleagues that this is something that's alien to a lot of women, and you see this in the workplace. Guys hang out together, they joke, they have this sort of competitive banter, and I think it isolates women, and they don't really understand, the nature of this communication.
Yeah. So hopefully that gives some ideas in that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for both of your really incredibly valid points. And I'm sure all of you at home were inspired by this incredible discussion. And we really hope that the future of our industry can continue without the presence of these biases, and that you all take the advice of our panelists at home. To you both, thank you very much for joining us today. You've been the last panel for this afternoon, and it's been really wonderful having you on board. So yeah, huge thanks to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. All the best.
Wonderful job. Wonderful job.
Thank you.
Now, that was one hell of a way to kick off our first ever YHS Virtual Summit. Just a little reminder for for you that you didn't subscribe yet for the second day, don't worry, you will receive a second email where you can just join for tomorrow. And then second, we apologize for the small technical issues that we had during the event. However, we really hope you were able to catch any comment and any insight of our experts.
Yeah, as she said, it's been an incredible afternoon. And again, we want to emphasize how much we value and treasure the input given by every party to really make this event as incredible as it was for us as well personally. So we hope you all learned and you've received valuable insights from today. You walk home with really the growth mindset and building on to the future. It's all of you who have come together who really inspired us and our team to do whatever stood in our power and really make these days happen. And we cannot thank you enough for this.
As we come to the end of day one of YHS Virtual, we would like to remind you all that we continue with the Virtual Summit tomorrow at 4 p.m. Central European Time. We hope you have all enjoyed this afternoon's event and send our best to everyone around the world. From your YHS team here at EHL in Lausanne to all of you around the world, good morning.
Good evening.
And good night.
Thank you.